Hi, my name is István. I'm a third-year PhD student at Lorentz University. In this talk, I'm going to introduce metatransactions, review existing and novel constructions, and discuss their security implications. To motivate metatransactions, let's consider the following example. There's a merchant who has several customers from all over the world, and it has some products that it sells on the blockchain. And the customers have some tokens issued by the merchant that they can use to purchase products from the merchant. And they potentially might also trade these tokens between each other. The problem is that they cannot just simply send these self-issued tokens to the merchant or between themselves unless they also have the native currency of the platform, because they somehow need to pay for the transaction fee of the platform where they issue these token transactions. And for example, in the largest blockchain by usage in Ethereum, if this whole micro ecosystem surrounding the shop would be deployed on Ethereum, then it's necessary for the customers to hold some Ether on their account. Otherwise, they cannot issue any transactions, they cannot issue any products from the merchant or trade these tokens between themselves. So as we have just seen before, the lack of meta-transactions creates deteriorated user experience because the users cannot interact with certain decentralized application unless they also have the native currency of the platform. It also creates mandatory rent for the holders of the native currency, as decentralized applications necessarily need to pay this rent in order to exist on the platform. Last but not least, the lack of meta-transactions also creates social coinism, and it stifles innovation because only one currency is eligible to pay the transaction fees. In an ideal free market environment, all the currencies should be able to pay the transaction fee. But wait, what are meta-transactions? They allow users to pay transaction fees in currencies other than the platform's native currency. So in case of Ethereum, we would like to have the possibility to pay transaction fees in, say, stable coins, in DAI. In the remainder of this talk, I'm going to give some empirical motivation using Ethereum blockchain data. After that, I will introduce a fee delegation scheme, which is similar to meta-transaction schemes, but do not achieve all of our initial goals. Hence, I will talk about meta-transaction designs, first a miner-based scheme and then a payment channel-based scheme. Afterwards, I will evaluate all three of these schemes. Later, I'm going to describe a blockchain currency takeover attack. And finally, I'm going to conclude my talk with some discussion and pointers to future work. Do we have quantitative data to motivate meta-transactions? As it turns out, yes, we considered all the transactions issued on Ethereum since its inception until 2019 July. We classified transactions into 4 categories, depending how they use the blockchain and the native currency. First, observe in yellow the transactions that only transfer Ether and do not even call smart contract functionalities. In green, we denote transactions that not only transfer Ether, but also invoke some smart contract functions. And in blue and red, we denote transactions, the number of transactions that only use the native currency Ether to pay the transaction fees. As you might observe, the transactions denoted in blue and red slowly but steadily take over the platform. So more and more transactions are used and issued on Ethereum, which do not necessarily need to rely on Ether because they only use it for the payment of the transaction fee. The next question we asked is, how often people issue meta transactions on the blockchain. So from a bird's view, a meta transaction might be a transaction which does not pay transactions fees in Ether. So we call these transactions zero gas price transactions on Ethereum. And what we have seen is that the number of zero gas price transactions, here denoted in red, well correlates with the transaction fees denominated in US dollar. So if the transaction fee increases, then also the number of zero gas price transaction increases. So this might indicate that whenever transaction fees are high, people want to issue meta transactions. Most likely, these zero gas price transactions are only issued by miners because as of today, zero gas price transactions are not relayed and not forwarded on the network layer. So whenever a miner has a chance to mine a block, they just include their own zero gas price transactions and just rebalance their accounts. So even though what we have seen is that there's an increasing demand for meta transactions, currently due to the limitations of the protocol, because they do not relay zero gas price transactions, uh, unfortunately, what we see is that mostly these zero gas price transactions are only used by miners. So that's the reason why we see a low number of zero gas price transactions. And now let's talk about how we can amend this situation. So the high-level goals we want to achieve with meta transactions are the following. First, we want to ensure the atomicity of transactions. Typically, a meta transaction consists of multiple transactions because a single transaction do not allow a user to do some actions and pay the transaction fee in a different currency. So typically, we need at least two transactions to achieve this functionality, and we want the atomicity of these transactions. If they are not atomic, it might be the case that a user can perform an action without paying the transaction fee. Obviously, this is bad for the miner and vice versa. So we also want to avoid the situation where the miner can steal the transaction fee payment from the users, but do not perform the desired action. So that's what we are referring as the atomicity of meta transactions. We would like to also achieve censorship resistance. So censoring meta transactions should be as difficult as censoring regular transactions. And last but not least, and maybe most importantly, we would like to achieve low overhead for meta transactions. First, let's discuss fee delegation schemes. Again, we have our beloved merchant with his shop, and then we have a lady, a customer who would like to perform some action, but it doesn't have the native currency of the platform. So what it does is she sends off-chain a message to the relayer. Afterwards, the relayer bundles this message into an on-chain transaction and broadcasts the on-chain transaction. Note that this transaction issued by the relayer still pays the transaction fee in the native currency. Afterwards, either the merchant or the customer can refund the relayer for such relayer services. We still not consider this as an optimal solution. We still do not consider this as a meta transaction scheme because it does not eliminate entirely the need of native cryptocurrency for transaction fee payment. Now let's discuss our first meta transaction scheme. We call this as miner-based scheme. It involves again our customer, our merchant, and a miner. And additionally, we introduce a so-called spendable address. We call this spendable because the underlying secret key is known to everyone. For instance, for such purposes, one could use simply just the generator point of the SACP 256K1 curve and the corresponding address. Note that any money spent to this address could be spent by any users. So our customer creates a transaction which performs some action, for example, sends some tokens to the merchant, and additionally also sends some custom tokens to this so-called spendable address. The miner cannot just include the second transaction in the block without including the first transaction, because in that case, the second transaction will not be valid without the inclusion of the first. Hence, we can achieve this way atomicity. At the end of the block, one can imagine that several payments, transaction fee payments, will be accrued on this spendable address. And since the miner is controlling all the transactions in her mined block, the miner can just claim at the end of this block all the accrued transaction fees. So the high-level idea of this scheme is that we want to amortize the cost of sending one transaction, one on-chain transaction, additional overhead for each meta transaction. Rather, we just want to send the action we want to perform on-chain and the transaction fee payment we want to do off-chain. So we can achieve this by applying payment channels. At this stage, we assume that the user already established payment channels with the largest mining pools. So whenever a user wishes to send an on-chain transaction, can send payments to mining pools off-chain. The only miner which can claim the transaction fee payment is the miner who included the transaction in the block. Note that in this scheme, the advantage is that we were able to issue several meta transactions at the cost of just opening and closing a payment channel. So it is no longer the case that we need to issue one additional transaction after every meta transaction, as it was the case in the miner-based scheme. We considered all the largest mining pools and assume that each sender will just establish payment channels with the largest mining pools. And note that the inclusion probability of a meta transaction scheme is proportional to the hash rate of the miner. So if altogether a user establishes payment channel to say to the 5 largest mining pools, then since the 5 largest mining pool controls already 80% of the hash rate in case of Ethereum, then the inclusion probability of a transaction just by establishing 5 payment channels will be at least 80%. After a few established payment channels, the marginal gain does not justify opening more payment channels because the cost of payment channels increases linearly in the number of opened payment channels, but the inclusion probability increases only marginally. We've already seen that the miner-based costs are linear in the number of issued meta transactions. Luckily, in the payment channel-based construction, the costs are proportional to the established payment channels. So for instance, if we issue 10 payment channels, then it is enough to issue as few as 50 meta transactions to already be better off just by using the payment channel scheme instead of the miner-based scheme. So here there's a trade-off between inclusion probability and cost. So we can increase the inclusion probability by establishing more payment channels with more miners. But in that case, we also need to use the meta transactions more to be better off. If a user issues K meta transactions, then both the miner and the relayer-based schemes incur K additional transactions overhead. However, the miner-based scheme is slightly more efficient than the relayer-based scheme. But in this regard, once the payment channels are set with sufficient amount of miners, then the channel-based scheme clearly wins in this regard because it does not require any on-chain overhead once the payment channels are set. So in that regard, meta transactions can be freely issued on chain, while the transaction fee payment can occur off chain. Putting this all together, what we can see is that both the miner and the relayer-based schemes severely decrease the throughput of the blockchain where they might have been applied. A fun application of meta transactions might be the attack we call the blockchain currency takeover. In this scenario, an attacker might subsidize the use of a currency C. So anytime transaction fees paid in this currency C, the attacker reimburses the users for the transaction fee payment. Such an attack might be launched trustlessly, where, for example, a smart contract automatically reimburses senders who pay the transaction fees in the currency the attacker wants. Since people do not want to pay the transaction fees, they will just switch eventually to this currency to pay the transaction fees. The cost of a blockchain currency takeover attack equals to the amount of transaction fees paid by users on a regular day. In case of Ethereum, we can see that this is substantially lower than just launching a 51% attack. However, deploying meta transactions on the mainnet come with some serious hurdles. As of today, zero gas price transactions are not forwarded, so all the transactions which do not pay transaction fees in the native currency, as of today, currently are considered as denial of service attack vectors, therefore they are already on the network layer, are not forwarded. It is also not clear how to negotiate the tokens with the miners. We cannot expect them to accept any type of tokens as payments for transaction fees. Most likely this requires a social consensus, but since this is a decentralized system, it sounds like a challenging endeavor. However, luckily this only requires a social consensus. It does not require a soft or a hard fork. We could potentially take the idea of meta transactions to the next level, but by also considering not only the payment of the transaction fees in a non-native currency, but also the payment of the block reward itself. So as previous literature showed, no blockchain platform is stable without block rewards. So it might make sense to introduce the so-called meta Coinbase, which is a Coinbase block reward payment to the miners, but not in the native currency, but in a non-native currency. It is an interesting idea to consider cross-chain meta transactions where the miners are reimbursed with tokens that live on a different blockchain. Last but not least, one of the most interesting areas for future work would be to consider confidential tokens for the transaction fee payment. In a confidential transaction, the amount of the transaction is hidden. Only the sender and the receiver knows that the exact transaction amount. All the rest of the world can, however, verify that the transaction amount is correct, meaning that no money is minted out of thin air. This would allow an efficient way to prevent front running, which is a huge issue nowadays on major blockchains. If transaction fees would be paid in confidential transactions using confidential tokens, then essentially front runners would not be able to tell what is the highest bid. They need to outbid, so it would essentially make front running impossible. If you want to dig deeper into the world of meta transactions, then you can do it because the paper is already online and available on archive. With that, thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.